Hey guys, tonight we're diving into some of the strangest things people really did in 1950s America. So before you get comfortable, make sure to subscribe to Midnight History for sleep and join us for more relaxing journeys into the past. Close your eyes and imagine a quiet American neighborhood in the 1950s. Freshly cut grass covered every front yard. Shiny cars sat in driveways. Families gathered around dinner tables every evening. From the outside, it looked like a perfect golden age. But beneath that picture-perfect image were many things that would seem completely unbelievable today. In fact, if someone described them without proof, you might think they were making them up. One of the strangest examples was how common smoking was. Cigarettes were everywhere. They appeared in magazines, on television in France, offices, schools, and even hospitals. Some advertisements actually featured doctors recommending certain cigarette brands. At the time, many people believed smoking was harmless. Some even thought it could help with stress and relaxation. Parents often smoked around their children without a second thought. The dangers that seem obvious today were not widely accepted yet. Another surprising part of life involved children and toys. Toy guns were extremely popular. Many children carried realistic-looking toy rifles and pistols while playing outside with friends. Parents rarely worried about it. For millions of families, it was simply considered normal childhood fun. Schools also practiced something that sounds very strange today. During the Cold War, students regularly participated in nuclear attack drills. When alarms sounded, children were instructed to hide under their desks and cover their heads. The idea was to prepare for a possible nuclear strike, even though such actions would offer little protection from a real explosion. Many people found comfort in believing they were prepared. Daily life was filled with unusual inventions as well. Companies constantly introduced products designed to save time and effort. Some gadgets were useful, while others were so odd that they quickly disappeared. Kitchens were filled with experimental appliances that promised a better future. Americans were fascinated by technology and believed new inventions could solve almost any problem. The future seemed bright, but everyday rules were often very different from modern expectations. Many workplaces had no restrictions on smoking indoors. Employees could sit at their desks surrounded by clouds of cigarette smoke throughout the day. Air quality was rarely discussed, and few people questioned whether breathing smoke for hours might be harmful. Health advice could also be surprising. Some advertisements promoted products that would never be approved today. Weight loss methods, miracle cures, and questionable medicines were sold with impressive promises. Consumers often trusted companies without demanding scientific proof. Television was becoming a powerful influence as well. Families gathered around their sets every evening to watch programs together. With only a few channels available, millions of people often watched the same shows at the same time. This created a shared culture that is difficult to imagine in today's world of endless streaming options. Meanwhile, suburban neighborhoods continued to expand across the country. New homes appeared quickly, often looking nearly identical to one another. Many families dreamed of owning a house with a neat lawn, a modern kitchen, and a shiny automobile parked outside. Owning these things became symbols of success and stability. Yet not everyone enjoyed the same opportunities. beneath the cheerful advertisements and optimistic television programs. Many Americans faced challenges that were rarely shown in public. Social expectations were strict, and people often felt pressure to fit into a particular image of the ideal family. Men were expected to be providers, while women were often encouraged to remain at home and manage the household. Questioning these roles was far less common than it is today. Even household chores looked different. Washing clothes, preparing meals, and cleaning the home required much more time and effort than most people realize. Although new appliances promised convenience, many tasks still demanded hours of daily work. Back. The 1950s can appear both familiar and strangely distant. It was a decade filled with confidence, invention, and rapid change. But it was also a time when many ordinary habits would leave modern people completely shocked. As the years passed, some of these customs disappeared, while others evolved into forms we still recognize today. Transportation offered another glimpse into how different the decade really was. Cars were more than simple vehicles. They represented freedom, success, and status. Families often spent weekends driving simply for enjoyment. Gasoline was inexpensive, roads were expanding, and long road trips became a popular part of American life. Automobile companies competed fiercely, producing larger cars with bright colours, shiny chrome details, and dramatic designs. Safety features that people expect today were often missing. Seatbelts were uncommon in many vehicles, and public awareness about road safety remained limited. Food habits could also seem unusual to modern eyes. Many families embraced highly processed foods because they were considered modern and convenient. Companies introduced frozen dinners, canned meals, powdered products, and instant mixes that promised to save time in the kitchen. Advertisements celebrated these products as symbols of progress. Some recipes from the period now appear very strange, combining ingredients that few people would think to put together today. The decade was also full of intense competition between companies, trying to attract consumers. Advertisements appeared almost everywhere. Businesses used colourful posters, radio programs, magazines, and television commercials to persuade families to buy the newest products. Children became important targets for advertisers as toys. Cereals and snacks were promoted directly to young audiences. At school, discipline was often stricter than many students experience today. Teachers were respected authority figures, and classrooms generally followed clear rules. Students stood when answering questions, memorized information regularly, and were expected to show obedience. Technology inside schools was limited compared to modern standards. There were no smartphones, no internet, and no laptops. Research often required visiting libraries and searching through shelves of books. Entertainment outside the home looked different as well. Many neighbourhoods had movie theatres that served as important social gathering places. Families attended community events, local sports games, and school activities. Without social media, people spent more time interacting face-to-face with neighbours and friends. While life moved at a slower pace in some ways, social pressure could be intense. People were often expected to follow unwritten rules about appearance, behaviour, and lifestyle. Anyone who stood out too much risked criticism from others. Yet despite these challenges, many Americans genuinely believed they were living in an age of endless possibility and progress. One of the most fascinating parts of 1950s America was the way people viewed the future. Many believed that technology would soon solve nearly every problem. Magazines featured illustrations of flying cars, robot servants, and futuristic cities filled with incredible machines. Children grew up imagining a world that seemed only a few years away. This excitement influenced everything from architecture to household products. New shopping centres appeared across the country and quickly became popular gathering places. Families could spend entire afternoons browsing stores, eating meals, and meeting friends. For many Americans, these modern shopping centres represented a new way of life. Television personalities and celebrities also gained enormous influence. Viewers often copied the clothing styles, hairstyles, and habits they saw on screen. Popular entertainers became household names known by millions. Because there were fewer entertainment choices, famous figures often had a larger cultural impact than celebrities today. Yet, despite all the optimism, many people lived with a constant sense of tension caused by the cold war. Newspapers regularly reported international conflicts and political disputes. Families discussed world events around dinner tables, wondering what the future might bring. Some households even built fallout shelters, believing they might one day need protection from a nuclear attack. These shelters were stocked with canned food, water, and emergency supplies. Looking back now, it seems unusual that fear and optimism existed side by side. On one hand, people worried about global conflict. On the other hand, they believed science and technology would create a better tomorrow. This combination shaped much of the decade's culture. Fashion reflected the era as well. Men often wore hats, polished shoes, and neatly pressed clothing. Women frequently dressed in elegant skirts, dresses, and carefully styled hairstyles. Even during ordinary daily activities, public appearance was considered extremely important. Many people felt pressure to present themselves in a respectable and successful manner whenever left home. The result was a society that appeared organized, confident, and prosperous on the surface. But beneath that image were countless unusual customs, forgotten habits, and surprising beliefs that make the 1950s feel like a completely different world. The deeper we explore the decade, the more strange and unexpected discoveries begin to appear. Another strange aspect of 1950s America was how much trust people placed in everyday products. Consumers often assumed that if something was sold in a store, it had already been proven safe. Companies took advantage of this confidence by making bold claims about their products. Advertisements promised healthier families, cleaner homes, and happier lives through the purchase of a single item. Bright illustrations and cheerful slogans filled magazines and television screens. Household cleaning products were especially popular. Many contained chemicals that would be heavily regulated today. Yet families used them without much concern. Parents trusted manufacturers and rarely questioned warning labels because such labels were often limited or completely absent. The same attitude appeared in many other areas of daily life. Children enjoyed freedoms that might surprise modern parents. Young boys and girls frequently spent entire days exploring neighbourhoods, parks, fields, and nearby streets without constant supervision. Parents expected them to return home by dinner time. There were no mobile phones to check their location. Independence was considered an important part of growing up. Summer days often felt endless, as groups of children created their own adventures. From morning until evening, neighborhood communities were usually close-knit. Many people knew the names of their neighbors and regularly visited one another without planning ahead. A knock on the front door was often enough to start a conversation or an invitation for coffee. Social life depended heavily on personal interaction rather than digital communication. Churches, schools, and local organizations played major roles in bringing communities together. Music was changing rapidly as well. The rise of rock and roll shocked many older Americans. Teenagers embraced exciting new sounds, while some parents worried that the music encouraged rebellious behavior. What now seems like harmless entertainment was considered controversial by certain groups at the time. Young people began developing their own culture, fashion trends, and tastes that differed from previous generations. This shift marked the beginning of major cultural changes that would become even more visible during the following decade. Although the 1950s are often remembered as simple and peaceful, the reality was far more complex. The decade was filled with contradictions, blending traditional values with rapid social change, old habits with futuristic dreams, and everyday routines with ideas that seem almost unbelievable today. The workplace of the 1950s would also feel unfamiliar to many modern people. Offices were filled with typewriters, filing cabinets, and stacks of paper. Important documents had to be typed by hand, copied physically, and delivered in person or through the mail. A task that now takes seconds on a computer could require hours or even days. Secretaries played a crucial role in keeping businesses organized, and many companies depended heavily on paperwork. Air conditioning was not as common as it would later become, making summers uncomfortable in many buildings. Banking was another activity that required patience. There was no online, no mobile apps and transfers. People visited local banks during business hours to manage their money. Checks were widely used, and financial transactions moved much more slowly than they do today. Even simple errands often demanded more time and planning. Medical care looked very different as well. Doctors had fewer tools and treatments available than modern medicine provides. Some illnesses that are easily treated today were far more serious during the 1950s. At the same time, public confidence in doctors was extremely high. Patients often accepted medical advice without question, believing experts always knew best. In many communities, the family doctor was one of the most respected people in town. Travel by airplane was becoming more common, but flying remained a special experience. Passengers dressed formally for flights, often wearing suits, ties, dresses, and polished shoes. Airports were less crowded, and security procedures were far simpler than modern travellers would expect. Flying carried an air of luxury and excitement that made even short journeys feel important. Television news brought distant events into living rooms across the nation. For the first time, millions of people could watch major stories unfold from their homes. This changed how Americans understood the world around them. Events that once seemed far away suddenly felt personal and immediate, as technology connected people more closely. Society continued changing at a remarkable pace. Yet despite all these developments, many everyday customs remained rooted in older traditions. This unique mixture of old-fashioned values and modern innovation is one reason the 1950s continue to fascinate people today. The decade stood at a crossroads between two worlds, preserving habits from the past while racing toward a future that seemed full of endless possibilities. As evening arrived in a typical 1950s neighborhood, life slowed into a familiar routine. Families gathered around the dinner table, often eating together nearly every night. Conversation was considered an important part of family life. Parents asked about school. Children shared stories from their day, and plans for the week were discussed face to face. Without smartphones, tablets, or social media competing for attention, people often spent more time interacting directly with one another. After dinner, many families moved into the living room to watch television. The television itself was usually one of the most valuable items in the house. Programs aired at specific times, and if you missed an episode, there was no easy way to watch it later. This made television feel like a shared national experience. Entire neighborhoods could be watching the same program at the same moment. Advertisers understood this power and eagerly competed for airtime. Consumer culture continued growing stronger throughout the decade. New products appeared constantly, each promising to improve daily life. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, kitchen mixers, and countless other appliances were marketed as symbols of modern living. Companies encouraged families to replace perfectly working items, simply because newer versions had become available. The idea of always upgrading to the latest model began taking root during this period. Holidays and celebrations also carried their own unique atmosphere. Communities decorated streets, organised parades, and held local events that brought people together. Small town traditions remained important even as cities expanded and populations grew. Neighbours often knew one another well enough to share food, exchange favours, and help during difficult times. Yet, beneath this sense of community, certain expectations could feel restrictive. Many people felt pressure to hide personal struggles in order to maintain the appearance of success and happiness. Problems such as stress, loneliness, or family difficulties were often discussed less openly than they are today. Maintaining a good reputation mattered greatly. The decade appears filled with smiling faces and cheerful advertisements. But real life was naturally more complicated. The contrast between the polished image presented to the world and the private realities experienced by ordinary families reveals another fascinating layer of 1950s America. The closer we look, the more we discover that this famous decade was both comforting and surprisingly strange at the same time. One area where the differences between the 1950s and today become especially clear is communication. A simple phone call required being near a telephone connected to the wall. There were no text messages, no social media notifications, and no instant video calls. If someone was not at home, you simply had to wait until they returned. Letters were still common, and many families regularly exchanged handwritten messages with relatives living far away. Receiving a letter in the mailbox could be an exciting event. Teenagers experienced life very differently as well. Dating followed rules that might seem unusual today. Parents often played a larger role in deciding who their children spent time with. Young couples frequently met at school events, dances, church gatherings, or community celebrations. Public behaviour was watched closely, and many teenagers worried about maintaining a respectable reputation. Schools organised social activities that helped shape much of teenage life. Drive-in theatres became another symbol of the decade. Families and couples could watch movies from inside their cars while enjoying snacks and spending time together. These theatres represented the growing importance of automobiles in American culture. On warm evenings, large parking areas filled with vehicles as people gathered to enjoy entertainment. Under the night sky, pets were becoming increasingly common members of households, although attitudes toward animal care often differed from modern standards. Dogs frequently spent more time outdoors, and veterinary medicine was less advanced than it is today. Even so, many families developed strong bonds with their pets and considered them important companions. The decade also witnessed rapid population growth. New schools, roads, shopping centres, and neighbourhoods appeared to accommodate expanding communities. Construction crews worked constantly as towns transformed into suburbs and suburbs grew into cities. Americans often felt they were participating in a period of extraordinary national growth. This sense of progress influenced how people viewed their future. They believed tomorrow would almost certainly be better than today. New inventions, stronger economies, and expanding opportunities encouraged optimism. While not every dream became reality, that confidence shaped the attitudes of millions. It was a world where people looked ahead with excitement, trusted technology to improve their lives, and embraced changes that would eventually transform society forever. Yet many of the customs they considered perfectly normal would seem remarkably strange to modern eyes. Perhaps one of the most surprising things about 1950s America was how quickly the world around people was, changing without them fully realizing it. New inventions entered homes every year. Scientific discoveries appeared in newspapers. Businesses expanded, cities grew larger, and opportunities seemed endless. Many Americans believed they were witnessing the beginning of a future that would surpass anything previous. Generations had imagined. Yet, at the same time, countless traditions from earlier decades remained firmly in place. Grandparents often shared stories from the Great Depression and World War II, reminding younger family members of hardships that were still fresh in memory. These experiences influenced how people spent money, raised children, and planned for the future. Saving resources and avoiding waste remained important values in many households. Education was increasingly viewed as a pathway to success. Parents encouraged children to study hard and pursue careers that could provide stability and prosperity. Schools emphasized discipline, responsibility, and respect for authority. For many students, the expectation was simple: work hard, follow the rules, and build a better life than the generation before them. Popular magazines painted an image of perfect family life, but reality was often more complicated. Families faced disagreements, financial pressures, and personal challenges just as they do today. The difference was that many people felt uncomfortable discussing such problems publicly. Maintaining appearances mattered greatly, and struggles were often kept private. Weather reports, news broadcasts, and entertainment programs all arrived through a limited number of sources. Because information travelled more slowly, rumours and local stories sometimes remained popular for weeks. Communities developed their own unique traditions and identities. Life felt more connected to local neighbourhoods than to global events, even as technology slowly began shrinking distances. Looking back now, it is easy to focus on the strange habits, unusual advertisements, and forgotten customs that made the 1950s so different. But beneath all of those differences were ordinary people trying to build happy lives for themselves and their families. They laughed, worried, dreamed, and planned for the future much like people do today. The details of their world may seem unusual, but the hopes and fears that guided them remain surprisingly familiar. And as we continue exploring this remarkable decade, even more unbelievable stories are waiting to be discovered. As the decade moved toward its end, Americans were beginning to notice that the world was changing faster than ever before. New products appeared in stores almost every week. Television sets became more common. Highways stretched across the country, and businesses competed fiercely to capture the attention of consumers. The pace of life still felt slower than today, but compared to previous generations, it seemed incredibly modern. Many families proudly filled photo albums with memories of vacations, birthdays, school events, and holiday gatherings. Cameras were becoming more affordable, allowing ordinary people to preserve moments from everyday life. Unlike modern smartphones, however, photographs could not be viewed instantly. Families often waited days or weeks for film to be developed before seeing the results. This delay made every photograph feel valuable. Household entertainment extended beyond television as well. Board games, card games, and radio programs remained popular. Families spent evenings together playing games, around the kitchen table or listening to music. Records filled living room shelves, and many teenagers saved money to buy the latest songs from their favourite artists. Music became an increasingly important part of youth culture, helping create a generation with tastes different from those of their parents. Shopping itself was a different experience. Many local stores were operated by families who knew their customers personally. Shop owners often recognised regular visitors by name and could recommend products based on individual preferences. This personal connection created a sense of community that many people remember fondly. At the same time, larger chain stores were beginning to expand, changing the way Americans purchased goods. Technology continued improving, but people still completed many tasks manually. Maps guided road trips. Calendars hung on kitchen walls. Important phone numbers were memorised or written in notebooks. Daily routines depended less on machines and more on habits that had been passed down through generations. Looking back, the 1950s occupy a unique place in history. They were neither entirely old-fashioned nor fully modern. Instead, they existed in the space between two eras. The decade combined traditional values with exciting new possibilities, creating a world that feels both familiar and strangely distant. And while many customs from that time have disappeared, their influence can still be seen in countless parts of everyday life today. Another detail that feels almost unbelievable today is how people consumed information. Most families received news from newspapers, radio broadcasts, and a few television channels, because there were fewer sources. Major events often united the attention of the entire country. When an important story appeared, millions of people discussed the same topic at work, at school, and around dinner tables. There was less information overall, but people often paid closer attention to what they received. Weather forecasts were also less precise than modern predictions. Families planning, vacations or outdoor events often relied on local reports that could change unexpectedly. Farmers, travellers, and business owners learned to adapt when forecasts turned out to be wrong. In more ways, daily life required greater patience because instant updates simply did not exist. Home design reflected the optimism of the era. Bright kitchens, colourful furniture, and modern appliances were proudly displayed to guests. Advertisements encouraged families to believe that the perfect home was within reach. If they purchased the newest products, many homeowners spent weekends improving their houses, planting gardens, or completing small repair projects. Neighbourhoods often looked neat and carefully maintained, because appearance carried significant social importance. Community events remained central to local life. School sports games, town fairs, church gatherings, and holiday celebrations brought people together throughout the year. These events created strong social bonds and gave neighbours opportunities to meet regularly. In smaller towns especially, people often knew not only their neighbours but also local shopkeepers, teachers, and community leaders. Children growing up during this period frequently remember spending hours outdoors. Parks, empty lots, forests, and sidewalks became places for imagination and adventure. Without digital entertainment available at all times, young people created games, built forts, rode bicycles, and explored their surroundings. Many parents expected their children to solve small problems independently, helping them develop confidence at an early age. As the 1950s drew closer to the 1960s, signs of change became increasingly visible. New ideas about culture, technology, and society were beginning to emerge. The comfortable world many Americans knew was about to experience transformations that few could fully predict. Yet for a brief moment, the decade remained suspended between the memories of the past and the possibilities of the future, creating one of the most fascinating periods in modern history. For many Americans, the end of the 1950s felt like standing at the doorway of a new age. Scientists spoke confidently about future discoveries. Newspapers published stories about rockets, space exploration, and technologies that seemed almost magical. Children imagined growing up in a world filled with robots and flying machines. Adults believed that prosperity would continue expanding for decades. The future looked bright, exciting, and full of possibilities. Yet some of the most memorable parts of life remained surprisingly simple. A family picnic in a local park, a baseball game on a summer afternoon, or a quiet evening on the front porch could provide hours of enjoyment. People often spent time talking with neighbours, writing letters to relatives, or listening to music together. Entertainment did not always require expensive equipment or constant stimulation. The rhythm of daily life encouraged moments of patience that are harder to find in the modern world. Businesses continued introducing products designed to make life easier. Every year seemed to bring another invention that promised to save time or reduce effort. Advertisements convinced consumers that modern living was becoming more comfortable than ever before. Refrigerators grew larger, televisions improved, and household appliances became increasingly common. Owning the latest model often became a source of pride. Meanwhile, schools prepared a new generation for opportunities their parents could barely imagine. Students learned about science, mathematics, literature, and history while growing up in a nation that saw itself as a global leader. Many young people expected their lives to be more prosperous than those of previous generations. And for many families, that expectation seemed realistic. Looking back from today, it is easy to smile at some of the decade's strange habits, unusual advertisements, and forgotten customs. The world of 1950s America included doctor-endorsed cigarettes, nuclear attack drills, bizarre inventions, and social rules that now feel outdated. Yet it was also a time of optimism, community, and belief in progress. These contrasts are what make the decade so fascinating. It was a world that often looked simple on the surface but contained countless surprising stories underneath. And as we continue our journey through the forgotten corners of history, we'll discover that some of the strangest chapters are still waiting ahead. As the 1950s finally came to a close, many Americans had no idea that their familiar world was about to change dramatically. Their comfortable routines, social customs, and expectations that had defined the decade would soon face challenges from a new generation with different ideas. But in those final years, most people were focused on everyday life rather than predicting the future. They woke up each morning, went to work, attended school, cared for their families, and continued building communities that felt stable and secure. One interesting feature of the era was how much trust people placed in institutions. Government agencies, schools, newspapers, and large companies generally enjoyed high levels of public confidence. Many citizens believed experts could solve most problems through planning, science, and innovation. This faith in progress shaped everything from city planning to education and technology. At the same time, Americans were becoming increasingly connected to the wider world. International news reached homes more quickly than ever before. Advances in transportation made travel easier. New products from around the globe began appearing in stores. The country was becoming more modern. Yet many traditional habits still remained part of daily life. The 1950s can seem like a peaceful and predictable decade. But reality was more complex. Beneath the polished advertisements and cheerful television programs existed fears about war, concerns about social change, and uncertainty about what the future might bring. People balanced hope with anxiety, excitement with caution, and tradition with innovation. Perhaps that is why the decade continues to capture the imagination of so many people today. It was a unique moment in history when old and new worlds existed side by side. Some customs now appear charming, others seem strange, and a few feel completely unbelievable. Yet together they created a fascinating portrait of everyday life in a rapidly changing society. The more closely we examine this period, the more we realize that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. Behind every photograph, advertisement, and family story lies another layer waiting to be discovered. and our journey through the surprising world of 1950s. America is not over yet, because some of the most unusual stories from this remarkable decade are still ahead of us. Many historians describe the 1950s as a decade of confidence, but confidence often hides unexpected stories. Beneath the polished surface of suburban neighbourhoods and cheerful advertisements were countless everyday experiences that rarely appeared in magazines. Factory workers spent long hours operating noisy machines. Farmers rose before sunrise to care for crops and animals. Small business owners worked tirelessly to support their families, while advertisements showed perfect lives. Ordinary Americans still faced the same challenges that people have always faced: earning a living, raising children, and planning for an uncertain future. The economy was growing, and many families enjoyed opportunities that had been difficult to imagine only a generation earlier. New homes were built rapidly, and millions of people moved into developing suburbs. These neighbourhoods promised safety, comfort, and a fresh start. Children played in yards, bicycles filled sidewalks, and families gathered for weekend barbecues. To many people, this represented the American dream. Yet life was not always as easy as it appeared. Many households carefully budgeted their money and worried about unexpected expenses. A broken appliance, a medical bill, or a car repair could create significant stress. Families often learned to repair things themselves rather than immediately replacing them. This practical attitude helped many households manage their finances. Education continued to expand as an important part of American life. Parents encouraged their children to study hard because they believed knowledge would create better opportunities. Libraries remained valuable community resources. Students spent hours reading books, completing assignments, and preparing for futures they hoped would be brighter than the past. Meanwhile, popular culture continued evolving. New fashions appeared, music styles changed, and young people developed interests that sometimes puzzled older generations. Every decade experiences a gap between generations, and the 1950s were no exception. Teenagers increasingly wanted their own identities, while parents often preferred traditional values. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on the unusual details that make the decade seem strange. But those details existed within the lives of real people who could never have imagined how different the future would become. Their world was changing quietly around them, preparing the way for the dramatic transformations that would soon arrive. In the years ahead, the closer we look at everyday life in the 1950s, the more we notice how different simple routines were from those of today. Shopping for groceries, for example, often involved visiting several different stores. A family might buy meat from a butcher, bread from a bakery, and other goods from a local market. Many shop owners knew their customers personally and often greeted them by name. This created a sense of familiarity that is less common in the age of large supermarkets and online shopping. Family meals remained an important daily tradition. Dinner was often served at a specific time, and family members were expected to sit together whenever possible. These meals were not only about food, but also about conversation and connection. Parents used the opportunity to discuss school, work, and community events. In many households, television stayed off during dinner because family interaction was considered more important. Leisure activities reflected a slower pace of life. People enjoyed simple pleasures such as gardening, fishing, reading newspapers, or attending local events. Community dances, school performances, and sports games attracted large crowds. These gatherings allowed neighbours to strengthen friendships and maintain close social ties. For many Americans, entertainment was something experienced together rather than individually. The design of homes also revealed changing ideas about modern living. Open kitchens, larger living rooms, and new appliances became increasingly popular. Families wanted homes that felt comfortable and practical while also showing signs of progress. Advertisements encouraged homeowners to update their furniture and decorations to keep pace with the latest trends. Children often had responsibilities that might surprise modern audiences. Many were expected to help with household chores, care for younger siblings, mow lawns, wash dishes, or assist with family businesses. These tasks were considered normal parts of growing up and teaching responsibility. Looking back, the decade appears filled with confidence and optimism. But that optimism was built upon the efforts of millions of ordinary people, working every day to improve their lives. Their routines may seem simple now, yet they helped shape a society that was rapidly moving toward a very different future. And as the 1960s approached, the calm and predictable world many Americans knew was beginning to change in ways few could fully imagine. Even something as ordinary as shopping for clothes was a different experience during the 1950s. Many people owned far fewer outfits than modern consumers. Clothing was often expected to last for years, and repairing damaged items was common. Mothers frequently learned sewing skills, allowing them to fix clothing rather than replace it. A torn shirt or loose button was not automatically thrown away. Instead, it was carefully repaired and used again. This practical mindset extended to many areas of life. Waste was generally discouraged, especially among adults who remembered the hardships of earlier decades. Children were taught to take care of their belongings because replacing them was not always easy or affordable. Toys, bicycles, books, and household items were often passed from one child to another. The school year also looked somewhat different. Classrooms relied heavily on chalkboards, textbooks, and handwritten assignments. Students learned penmanship, memorized facts, and spent long periods practicing skills through repetition. Teachers were often viewed as authority, figures whose instructions were rarely questioned. Many schools began the day with routines that emphasized discipline and respect. Summer vacations felt especially exciting because children spent much of their free time outdoors. Neighborhood baseball games, bicycle races, and adventures with friends filled long afternoons. Without video games or internet entertainment, imagination played a major role in daily life. A vacant field could become a battlefield, a jungle, or an unexplored world depending on the game being played. Adults often trusted children with greater independence than many parents would allow today. Another interesting part of the decade was the growing fascination with space and science. Newspapers regularly reported new discoveries and technological achievements. The idea that humans might one day travel beyond Earth captured the imagination of millions. Children dreamed of becoming astronauts long before space travel became a reality. Toy rockets, science kits, and futuristic stories became increasingly popular. Lebach. These dreams reveal just how optimistic many Americans felt about the future. They believed tomorrow would bring extraordinary inventions and opportunities. While not every prediction came true, the excitement of the era left a lasting mark on society. It was a time when people looked toward the horizon with curiosity, believing that the best days were still ahead. Even though enormous, changes were quietly approaching, just beyond the edge of the decade. By the late 1950s, many Americans felt they were living in one of the most advanced societies the world had ever seen. New highways connected distant cities, modern appliances filled homes, and technology seemed to improve every year. Yet, if a person from that era suddenly appeared in the modern world, they would likely be shocked by how much daily life has changed. The internet alone would seem like science fiction. The ability to instantly communicate with someone across the planet, watch thousands of television programs on demand, or carry a powerful computer inside a pocket would have appeared almost magical. In the 1950s, information moved much more slowly. Patience was a necessary part of life. People waited for letters, newspapers, film photographs, and scheduled broadcasts. This slower pace influenced how individuals thought, planned, and interacted with one another. Conversations often lasted longer because there were fewer distractions competing for attention. Visits with friends and relatives were important social events rather than quick exchanges of messages. The decade also produced countless small customs that have largely disappeared. Milk was often delivered directly to homes. Newspapers arrived at front doors every morning. Service stations frequently had attendants who pumped gasoline for customers. Department stores offered personal assistance from employees who spent time helping shoppers choose products. These details may seem minor, but together they created a daily experience very different from modern life. Many Americans believed their way of life would continue unchanged for generations. They could not yet see the cultural shifts, technological revolutions, and social transformations that would reshape the coming decades. For them, the routines of the 1950s felt permanent and familiar. Looking back now, that confidence gives the decade a unique charm. It was a moment suspended between the struggles of the past and the uncertainties of the future. A world of chrome-covered cars, television dinners, neighbourhood gatherings, and endless optimism. And while many of its habits now seem unusual or even unbelievable, they provide a fascinating window into how ordinary people lived, worked, dreamed, and imagined the future in one of the most memorable decades of American history. Of course, not everything about the 1950s was comfortable or easy. Many people worked physically demanding jobs that required long hours and considerable effort. Factory workers stood beside loud machinery throughout the day. Construction crews worked in heat, cold, and rain. Farmers depended heavily on weather conditions that could determine whether an entire season would be successful or disappointing. Daily life demanded resilience, patience, and hard work. Despite these challenges, communities often developed strong support networks. Neighbours helped one another during difficult times. If a family faced illness, financial hardship, or an emergency, local residents frequently stepped forward to assist. This sense of community created bonds that many people remembered fondly for the rest of their lives. Churches, schools, and local organisations played important roles in maintaining these connections. Another fascinating feature of the era was the growing popularity of family vacations. As automobiles became more reliable and highways expanded, more families began exploring different parts of the country. Children stared out car windows for hours, while parents followed. Paper maps across unfamiliar roads, roadside diners, motels, and tourist attractions became memorable parts of the travel experience. For many families, these trips created stories that would be shared for decades. Advertising continued shaping public opinion in powerful ways. Companies promoted products, not only as useful items but also as symbols of success and happiness. Buying the right car, refrigerator, or television was often presented as a step toward achieving the ideal life. This message influenced how people viewed themselves and their neighbours. Yet beneath the advertisements and promises, most happiness still came from simple things: friendships, family gatherings, shared meals, and personal achievements. As historians study the decade today, they often discover that the real story of the 1950s is more interesting than the popular image. It was not simply a perfect golden age, nor was it a period without problems. Instead, it was a complex and fascinating time filled with optimism, contradictions, innovation, and tradition. The people who lived through it experienced a world that was changing rapidly, even if they could not always see where those changes would eventually lead. And the closer we examine their lives, the more surprising details continue to emerge from this remarkable chapter of American history. As we move deeper into the story of 1950s America, one thing becomes increasingly clear. People of that era were living through a period they believed would be remembered as the beginning of a better future. Every year seemed to bring another innovation, another convenience, or another reason for optimism. Newspapers celebrated scientific achievements. Television programs showcased modern lifestyles. Politicians spoke about progress and opportunity. For many families, the future appeared brighter than ever before. Yet everyday life still contained many routines that had existed for generations. Families hung laundry outside to dry. Children completed chores before playing with friends. And neighbours often borrowed tools or ingredients from one another. These simple interactions helped create a sense of belonging that many people considered normal at the time. In cities, life moved at a faster pace. Streets were busy with shoppers, office workers, delivery trucks, and public transportation. Small restaurants, movie theatres, and local stores filled neighbourhoods with activity. Meanwhile, in rural areas, traditions often changed more slowly. Farmers and small-town residents maintained lifestyles that sometimes differed greatly from those found in rapidly growing suburbs. One particularly interesting aspect of the decade was how much importance people placed on manners. Children were taught to say please and thank you, stand when greeting adults, and show respect to teachers and elders. Good behaviour was considered an essential part of becoming a successful adult. Schools, parents, and community leaders all reinforced these expectations. Evening routines also reflected a calmer pace of life. After dinner, families might listen to music, read books, work on hobbies, or watch a favourite television programme. Many people went to bed earlier than modern audiences because entertainment options were limited and workdays often started early. The glow of a television screen or a bedside lamp provided a peaceful end to the day. Labak. These moments reveal a world that was neither completely modern nor entirely traditional. It was a society balancing old customs with new possibilities, creating a unique atmosphere that existed only for a brief period in history. And while the decade may seem distant now, the experiences of the people who lived through it continue to offer fascinating insights into how quickly the world can change. The 1950s were also a time when trust and routine shaped much of everyday life. Most people followed predictable schedules. Stores opened and closed at regular hours. Families ate meals at nearly the same time each day. And Sundays were often reserved for church, family visits, or rest. Life felt structured in a way that many modern people would find unusual. There were fewer interruptions, fewer notifications, and fewer demands competing for attention every minute of the day. This slower rhythm allowed people to focus more on the immediate world around them. Neighbourhoods developed their own identities. Children knew which houses offered the best Halloween candy, which neighbours enjoyed gardening, and where friends usually gathered after school. Front porches were important. Social spaces where conversations could last for hours on warm evenings. People often sat outside simply to talk, watch the sunset, or greet passing neighbours. These small moments helped create a strong sense of community that many Americans still remember with nostalgia. The workplace was changing too. Large corporations continued expanding, creating new opportunities for office workers. Many employees expected to stay with the same company for years, sometimes even for their entire careers. Loyalty between employers and workers was often viewed as a valuable relationship. Promotions could take time, but many people believed hard work and patience would eventually be rewarded. At the same time, technology slowly transformed daily tasks. New machines made factories more productive. Household appliances reduced some domestic labour, and improved transportation connected distant parts of the country. Each innovation seemed to confirm the belief that progress was unstoppable. This confidence influenced how people viewed the future, encouraging dreams of even greater achievements in the decades ahead. Yet despite all the excitement surrounding modernization, simple pleasures remained at the centre of life. A family gathering, a baseball game on a sunny afternoon, a school concert, or a community picnic could become cherished memories. These experiences required no advanced technology, only time spent together. Looking back now, one of the most remarkable things about the 1950s is how ordinary people balanced tradition and change. They embraced new inventions while holding onto familiar customs. They looked toward the future with hope while remaining connected to the values they had inherited from previous generations. It was this combination that gave the decade its distinctive character, making it one of the most fascinating and memorable periods in American history. As the decade approached the 1960s, Americans continued living in a world that felt increasingly modern while still holding onto traditions from the past. New highways stretched across the country, connecting cities and making travel easier than ever before. Families could drive hundreds of miles to visit relatives, explore national parks, or take vacations that would have been difficult only a generation earlier. For many children, these road trips became some of their happiest memories. Long hours in the family car were filled with games, conversations, and excitement about reaching a new destination. Television continued expanding its influence as well. What began as a luxury item was quickly becoming a normal part of everyday life. Families arranged furniture around the television set, and evening schedules often revolved around favourite programmes. Advertisers recognised the power of this new medium and invested enormous amounts of money into commercials designed to capture attention. Many famous advertising slogans from the era remained recognisable for decades afterward. Meanwhile, schools prepared students for a future that seemed full of opportunity. Teachers encouraged hard work, discipline, and ambition. Science education became increasingly important as technological competition captured national attention. Children were taught that education could open doors to careers that previous generations could scarcely imagine. For many families, sending a child to college became a major goal. Fashion also continued evolving. New styles emerged, influenced by movie stars, musicians, and television personalities. Teenagers paid close attention to trends and often used clothing to express their identity. This growing youth culture would soon become one of the defining forces of the next decade. Adults sometimes viewed these changes with curiosity, while others worried that traditional values might be fading. Yet despite these concerns, daily life remained surprisingly ordinary for most people. Parents went to work, children attended school, neighbours exchanged greetings, and communities gathered for local events. The world seemed stable and familiar. Few people realised just how dramatically society would transform in the years ahead. Looking back, the late 1950s feel almost like the final chapter of one era, before the beginning of another. It was a moment when optimism remained strong. Communities felt closely connected, and many Americans believed the future would bring nothing but progress. That belief, whether accurate or not, shaped the attitudes and dreams of millions of people living through one of the most fascinating decades in modern history. The closer we get to the end of the 1950s, the more we can see a society standing between two different worlds. One foot remained planted in traditions that had guided families for generations, while the other stepped toward a future shaped by technology, science, and rapid change. Most people did not think of themselves as living through a historic transition. They were simply focused on everyday responsibilities, earning a living, raising children, maintaining homes, and planning for the years ahead. Yet history would later remember this period as one of the most influential decades of the 20th century. In many neighbourhoods, evenings followed a familiar pattern. Streetlights slowly illuminated quiet roads. Children returned home after playing outside. Families gathered for dinner, finished household chores, and settled into comfortable routines. The sounds of television programs drifted from open windows. Dogs barked in distant yards, and neighbours exchanged friendly greetings before heading inside for the night. There was a calmness to these scenes that many people would later remember with affection. The economy continued creating opportunities for millions. New businesses opened, factories produced enormous quantities of goods, and consumers eagerly purchased products that promised a more convenient life. Refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and televisions became symbols of modern living. For many households, owning these items represented progress and success. Advertising reinforced this idea constantly, encouraging families to believe that happiness could be achieved through the latest products and innovations. Yet, despite all the excitement surrounding modern conveniences, people still relied heavily on one another. Friends helped friends move into new homes. Neighbours shared tools, advice, and assistance during difficult times. Organisations organised events that brought people together throughout the year. These social connections helped create a sense of stability and belonging that many Americans valued deeply. Looking back now, it is tempting to view the 1950s through a lens of nostalgia. But the reality was more complex. It was a decade filled with hopes, fears, achievements, and contradictions. Some ideas from that era seem outdated today, while others continue to influence modern life. What remains most fascinating is how ordinary people experienced these changes without fully realizing how important their decade would become. They were simply living their lives, unaware that future generations would look back on their world with curiosity, surprise, and endless fascination. By 1960, the America that had defined the previous decade was beginning to fade. Though few people noticed it at the time, the routines, values, and expectations of the 1950s still felt permanent. Parents continued believing that hard work would lead to success. Children still rode bicycles through quiet neighbourhoods. Families still gathered around television sets in the evenings. Yet beneath the surface, powerful changes were already underway. New generations were growing up with different ideas about the world. Technology was advancing at a speed that seemed almost impossible. The future that people had dreamed about throughout the decade was slowly becoming reality. One of the most remarkable things about the 1950s is how much hope people carried with them. They had lived through economic hardship and global war. Yet many remained optimistic about what lay ahead. They believed science would cure diseases, technology would improve daily life, and education would create new opportunities. This confidence influenced everything from architecture and transportation to entertainment and family life. It was an era that looked forward rather than backward. At the same time, many customs that seemed completely normal then would appear strange to modern audiences. Children playing without supervision for hours, doctors appearing in cigarette advertisements, nuclear attack drills in classrooms, and countless forgotten household products all remind us how different the world once was. These details may seem unusual today, but they were simply part of everyday life for millions of ordinary people. History often focuses on presidents, wars, and major events, but the true character of a decade is found in the daily experiences of the people who lived through it, the conversations around dinner tables, the excitement of a family vacation, the sound of a favourite song on the radio, and the dreams people held about the future all help us understand what life was really like. The 1950s were not perfect, nor were they as simple as nostalgic memories sometimes suggest. They were a complex mixture of optimism, tradition, innovation, and uncertainty. Yet perhaps that is exactly why the decade continues to fascinate us. It feels close enough to recognise, but distant enough to seem almost unbelievable. And as we leave behind the strange and surprising world of 1950s America, we can appreciate how much has changed while also noticing how many human hopes, fears, and dreams have remained exactly the same. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within the strange world of 1950 Sekunde America. Every generation believes its way of life is normal. People rarely stop to consider that future generations might look back at their habits with surprise or disbelief. The families of the 1950s certainly did not imagine that one day people would carry powerful computers in their pockets, communicate instantly across continents, or access nearly all human knowledge with a few taps on a screen. To them, their world felt modern, advanced, and full of promise. They were living at the edge of what seemed possible. Children growing up during the decade dreamed about becoming pilots, scientists, teachers, athletes, and explorers. Many spent hours reading adventure stories, watching television programs, and imagining the future. Parents worked hard to provide opportunities that had not existed when they were young. Communities invested in schools, roads, and businesses because they believed progress would continue for generations. There was a widespread feeling that tomorrow could be better than today if people remained determined and optimistic. Looking back through old photographs, it is easy to notice the differences. The cars look unusual, the clothing styles seem old-fashioned, and the technology appears primitive. Yet, when we look beyond those details, we find people who were remarkably similar to us. They worried about their families, celebrated important milestones, enjoyed time with friends, and hoped for a brighter future. Their world may have been different, but their emotions were very familiar. That is what makes history so fascinating. It allows us to step into another time and discover both the differences and similarities between generations. The 1950s were filled with strange inventions, forgotten customs, surprising beliefs, and unforgettable moments. But they were also filled with ordinary people trying to live meaningful lives in a rapidly changing world. As the decade disappeared into history, many of its traditions faded away, while others evolved and survived. Even today, traces of the 1950s can still be found in neighbourhoods, family traditions, popular culture, and everyday habits. The decade may be gone, but its influence remains woven into the world around us, quietly reminding us of a time when America stood on the threshold of a new age and looked toward the future with extraordinary confidence. If there is one thing that surprises historians most about the 1950s, it is how quickly an entire way of life can seem to disappear. At the time, people believed many of their customs would last forever. Neighbourhood milk deliveries, family-owned stores, evening conversations on front porches, and entire communities gathering around a handful of television channels all felt permanent. Yet within only a few decades, many of these routines became rare or vanished completely. Change often arrives quietly. People living through it rarely notice how much the world is transforming until they look back years later. The children of the 1950s would eventually grow up to witness some of the greatest technological advances in human history. They would see humans travel into space, computers enter homes, the internet connect the globe, and mobile phones become everyday necessities. Many of the futuristic ideas they imagined as children would become reality during their lifetimes. Yet, despite these incredible developments, many people would later remember the simple pleasures of the 1950s most fondly. They remembered friendly neighbours, community gatherings, family dinners, and long summer evenings spent outdoors. They remembered a world that felt smaller, slower, and perhaps easier to understand. Whether those memories reflected reality or nostalgia is a question historians still debate. Every generation tends to view the past through a softer lens, remembering its happiest moments while forgetting many of its difficulties. The truth is that the 1950s contain both comfort and challenge, optimism and anxiety, progress and limitation. It was neither a perfect golden age nor a dark and troubled period. It was simply a time when ordinary people were doing their best to navigate a changing world. As we examine their lives today, we gain a better understanding not only of the past but also of ourselves. Future generations may someday look back at our own era with the same curiosity that we bring to the 1950s. They may find our habits strange, our technology primitive, and our assumptions surprising. History has a way of reminding us that what feels normal today may seem extraordinary tomorrow. And perhaps that is why exploring the forgotten world of 1950s America remains so fascinating. It shows us how quickly society can change while also revealing the timeless hopes, fears, and dreams that connect people across generations. As the lights of the decade slowly fade and the sounds of another era drift into silence, we leave behind a world that feels distant, familiar, and wonderfully strange all at once. And so, as the story of 1950s America continues to drift further into the past, we begin to understand why this decade remains so captivating. It was a time suspended between memory and modernity, between traditions that had existed for generations and innovations that would reshape the future. People living during those years could not see the full picture. They could not know which inventions would change the world, which customs would disappear, or which moments would one day become symbols of an entire era. They were simply living one ordinary day at a time. On any given morning, a family might wake to the sound of a radio playing in the kitchen. Parents prepared for work while children got ready for school. Cars rolled slowly through quiet neighbourhoods. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors. Factory whistles signalled the beginning of another workday. Nothing about these moments seemed historic. Yet together they formed the fabric of a decade that future generations would study, celebrate and debate. The remarkable thing about history is that it is rarely aware of itself while it is happening. The people of the 1950s did not wake up thinking they were living in a famous era. They worried about bills, family responsibilities, school assignments, and daily routines. Their concerns were practical and immediate. Yet those ordinary experiences became the building blocks of history. Today, old photographs from the decade often appear frozen in time. Smiling families stand beside shiny automobiles. Children pose proudly with bicycles. Friends gather at diners and neighbourhood events. These images create the impression of a simpler world. But behind every photograph was a real life filled with challenges, ambitions, disappointments, and dreams. History becomes most interesting when we remember that the people in those pictures were not characters from a distant story. They were individuals living through the present just as we are now. The passage of time transforms ordinary moments into historical artifacts. A newspaper, a television commercial, a family vacation, or a school event may seem unimportant in the moment. Yet decades later, they become windows into another world. That is exactly what makes the 1950s so fascinating. The decade offers countless glimpses into a society that feels both recognizable and unfamiliar. It reminds us that every generation experiences its own version of normal life, never fully realizing how unusual that life may appear to those who come after. And as our journey through this strange and unforgettable decade continues, even more hidden stories remain waiting in the shadows of history. The further we travel from the 1950s, the easier it becomes to forget just how different the world once felt. Today, information moves instantly across the globe. News reaches millions of people within seconds. Entertainment is available at any moment. Yet, in the 1950s, life unfolded at a slower and often more predictable pace. Waiting was a normal part of everyday existence. People waited for letters to arrive, for photographs to be developed, for television programs to air, and for newspapers to be delivered each morning. Patience was not considered a skill. It was simply a fact of life. This slower pace influenced how people experienced time itself. Moments were often savoured because they could not easily be repeated. A family vacation might be discussed for years. Afterward, because photographs were limited and travel opportunities were less frequent, a favourite television programme became an event because there was no option to watch it later. Even conversations carried a different weight because they usually happened face to face, rather than through screens. Another fascinating aspect of the decade was the confidence many people placed in the future. Scientists, engineers, and inventors were widely admired. New technologies inspired excitement rather than suspicion. Each advancement seemed to promise a better tomorrow. Children read stories about space travel and imagined futures filled with incredible machines. Adults invested in homes, education, and businesses because they believed progress would continue. This optimism became one of the defining characteristics of the era. At the same time, daily life remained grounded in routines that had changed very little for decades. Families gathered for meals, attended community events, and maintained close relationships with neighbours. Many social interactions took place in person, creating strong local connections. While modern technology has made communication easier, it has also changed the way communities function. Looking back, the 1950s feel almost like the final years of one world, before the arrival of another. They were a bridge between older traditions and the technological age that followed. The people living through those years could not know how dramatically society would change, but they were already laying the foundations for the future. Their choices, inventions, and dreams helped shape the world we know today. And perhaps that is why the decade continues to fascinate us, because it allows us to witness the moment just before history turned the page and entered a completely new chapter. As history moved beyond the 1950s, many of the decade's most familiar sights slowly began to disappear. The corner stores where shopkeepers knew every customer by name faced competition from larger businesses. Neighbourhoods grew, cities expanded, and new technologies entered homes at an astonishing rate. Yet, for the people who had lived through the decade, memories of those years remained vivid. They remembered the smell of fresh newspapers in the morning, the excitement of hearing a favourite song on the radio, and the feeling of gathering around a television set that seemed miraculous at the time. They remembered a world where children spent entire afternoons outdoors without parents constantly checking on them. Summer days felt endless. Bikes lined front yards, baseball games appeared in empty fields, and imagination transformed ordinary places into grand adventures. A vacant lot could become a castle, a battlefield, or a distant planet. Entertainment often came not from devices but from creativity and friendship. Adults also experienced a different relationship with time. Many stores closed earlier than they do today. Sundays were quieter. Fewer businesses operated around the clock. Pace of life encouraged people to focus on local communities and personal relationships. There were fewer distractions competing for attention every minute of the day. This slower rhythm helped create a sense of stability that many people later described with affection. Of course, not everything was perfect. Every era has its challenges, and the 1950s were no exception. People worried about money, employment, health, and world events just as they do today. Families faced disagreements, setbacks, and uncertainty. Yet despite these difficulties, many Americans maintained a remarkable sense of optimism. They believed the future would reward hard work and determination. They expected new discoveries to improve daily life. They looked ahead with confidence rather than fear. Perhaps that optimism is one reason the decade continues to capture the imagination. It represents a moment when people felt that tomorrow held endless possibilities. Looking back now, we can see both the strengths and weaknesses of that world. We can appreciate its sense of community while recognizing its limitations. We can smile at its strange inventions and forgotten customs while understanding that they made perfect sense to the people living at the time. In the end, the story of 1950s America is really the story of ordinary people navigating a world on the edge of extraordinary change, unaware that future generations would one day look back on their lives with fascination and wonder when we study the 1950s today. It is easy to focus on the unusual details that make the decade seem so different from our own. The cars were larger, the technology was simpler, and many social customs now appear outdated. But perhaps the most interesting thing about the era is not what was different. It is what remained the same. People still fell in love, worried about their children, hoped for better opportunities, and dreamed about the future. The basic human experience changed far less than the inventions surrounding it. A father returning home from work wanted to provide for his family. A mother hoped her children would grow up healthy and successful. Teenagers searched for independence and excitement. Children imagined adventures beyond their neighborhoods. These desires are timeless. They connect the people of the 1950s to every generation that came before and after them. Yet the world around them was changing rapidly. Air travel became more common. Television reached more homes. Scientific discoveries captured public attention. New products appeared constantly, promising convenience and comfort. Each year seemed to move society a little closer to the future people had imagined. Looking through old magazines from the period reveals a fascinating mixture of confidence and curiosity. Advertisements predicted incredible inventions. Experts discussed what life might look like in 20 or 30 years. Some predictions were surprisingly accurate, while others now seem amusingly unrealistic. Few people imagined the exact shape the future would take, but many believed it would be exciting. That belief helped define the spirit of the decade. The 1950s also remind us how quickly normal life can become history. The routines people followed every day seemed ordinary to them. They did not realize that future generations would study their fashions, their homes, their entertainment, and even their advertisements. They were simply living in the present. Yet those ordinary moments eventually became historical memories. Perhaps that is why exploring this decade feels so captivating. It allows us to step into a world that was familiar to millions of people, yet now seems almost foreign. A world of neighborhood diners, family road trips, television evenings, and endless optimism. A world where the future felt close enough to touch, even though nobody knew exactly what it would bring. And as the memories of the 1950s continue to fade into the distance, they leave behind a fascinating reminder of how quickly time transforms everyday life into history. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the 1950s is that people living through the decade rarely stop to appreciate how unique their moment in history truly was. To them, life simply felt normal. The cars, the music, the clothing, the advertisements, and the routines were all part of everyday existence. Nobody wakes up believing they are living in a future history book. Yet decades later, those ordinary moments become valuable clues that help us understand an entire era. Imagine walking through a typical American town on a warm evening in 1958. Neon signs glow above local diners. Families stroll along sidewalks after dinner. Teenagers gather near jukeboxes listening to the latest records. Children laugh as they race bicycles down quiet streets. The smell of freshly cut grass drifts through the air while television sets flicker behind living room windows. It is not a special occasion. It is simply another ordinary night. Yet that ordinary night represents a world that no longer exists. As the years passed, technology accelerated. New forms of communication changed relationships. Entertainment expanded beyond anything the people of the 1950s could have imagined. Communities grew larger, lifestyles became faster, and daily routines evolved. Many customs that once seemed permanent quietly disappeared. Still, some values survived. Family gatherings, friendships, personal ambition, and the desire for a better future remained important. The tools changed, but human nature stayed remarkably familiar. That may be why the decade continues to fascinate modern audiences. It feels distant enough to be mysterious, yet close enough to recognize. We can still see reflections of ourselves in the people who lived during those years. Their hopes were our hopes. Their worries were our worries. Their dreams for tomorrow sound surprisingly similar to our own. History often teaches us that every generation believes it is modern. Every generation thinks its customs are normal. And every generation is eventually replaced by something new. The people of the 1950s could not know that future generations would study their lives with curiosity and nostalgia. Yet their world became one of the most remembered and discussed periods in modern American history. And the deeper we explore that world, the more we discover that, beneath the strange habits and forgotten traditions, were ordinary people simply trying to make sense of their place in a rapidly changing age. As our journey through the strange world of 1950s America continues, it becomes clear that the decade was built on a powerful belief that the future would be better than the past. This belief appeared everywhere. It could be seen in advertisements promoting new appliances, in schools encouraging children to pursue ambitious careers, and in families saving money for homes, cars, and education. Progress was not just an idea. It was something people expected to experience during their own lifetimes. Every new invention seemed to confirm that expectation. Yet there was also something deeply comforting about the routines that filled daily life. People knew their neighbours, recognised familiar faces in local stores, and often spent years building connections within the same communities. Many children attended the same schools as their older siblings. Families visited the same churches, parks, and businesses for years. These traditions created a sense of stability that helped people feel connected to the world around them. Looking back now, one of the most surprising aspects of the decade is how much trust people placed in institutions and experts. Doctors, teachers, government officials, and business leaders were often viewed with a level of confidence that seems unusual today. Most people believed that science and education would solve major problems and improve life for future generations. This optimism influenced public attitudes toward everything, from medicine to space exploration. Of course, history reminds us that every era contains blind spots. Some ideas that seemed sensible in the 1950s later proved to be mistaken. Certain products considered safe were eventually recognized as dangerous. Social customs, once accepted, became subjects of criticism and debate. The passage of time changed how people viewed many aspects of the decade. But this is true of every period in history. Future generations will almost certainly look back at our own time with similar surprise. What seems normal today may appear strange tomorrow. That is one reason studying the past is so valuable. It teaches us humility and reminds us that society is always evolving. The people of the 1950s were not living in a perfect world, nor were they living in a foolish one. They were simply doing what all generations do, adapting to the circumstances of their time while trying to build a better future for those who would come after them. And in that sense, their story is not so different from our own. The longer we examine the 1950s, the more we realise that the decade was filled with contradictions. It was a time of enormous confidence, yet many people lived with fears about the future. It was a period of technological progress, yet daily life still depended on many traditions that had existed for generations. Americans dreamed about rockets, space travel, and futuristic cities while still gathering around dinner tables each evening to discuss local news and neighbourhood events. This combination of old and new gave the decade a character unlike any other. One reason the era continues to fascinate historians is that it marked the beginning of changes that would transform the modern world. Many of the technologies we take for granted today can trace their roots back to ideas and innovations that emerged during those years. Businesses invested heavily in research. Scientists explored new possibilities. Engineers designed products that seemed revolutionary at the time. Not every invention succeeded, but the spirit of experimentation was everywhere. Meanwhile, ordinary people focused on building stable lives. Parents wanted secure jobs, safe neighbourhoods, and good schools for their children. Young people looked forward to adulthood with optimism. Communities organised events, supported local businesses, and celebrated holidays together. Life was often centred around family and neighbourhood, relationships rather than global networks and digital platforms. Looking through photographs from the decade, we see smiling faces at picnics, school dance or events, and family gatherings. These images capture moments of happiness, but they also remind us that history is made up of countless ordinary experiences. The 1950s were not defined only by famous events or major political decisions. They were shaped by millions of small moments lived by ordinary people every day. A conversation on a front porch, a drive to a local diner, a family vacation, or a child riding a bicycle down a quiet street all contributed to the story of the decade. Perhaps that is why the era feels so memorable. It offers a glimpse into a world that was changing rapidly, yet still retained a sense of simplicity. A world where people believed in progress, trusted the future, and could not yet imagine how dramatically society would evolve in the decades ahead. And as we continue exploring the forgotten corners of 1950s America, even more surprising details remain waiting to be uncovered. One of the most interesting questions we can ask about the 1950s is whether the people living in that decade felt as nostalgic about their own past as we feel about them today. The answer is often yes. Many adults in the 1950s looked back fondly on the years before World War II. They remembered older traditions, familiar neighbourhoods, and simpler ways of life that seemed to be disappearing. In this way, every generation shares something in common. People often believe that the world is changing too, quickly, and that something valuable is being left behind. Yet at the same time, they are usually excited about new opportunities and inventions. The 1950s perfectly captured this balance between nostalgia and progress. Families embraced modern conveniences while still holding on to customs passed down from parents and grandparents. Children learned new ideas in school while hearing stories about earlier times at home. Society was constantly moving forward, but it never completely let go of the past. This mixture created a unique atmosphere that is difficult to recreate today. Even architecture reflected this transition. New suburban homes featured modern designs and appliances. Yet many families filled them with traditions that had existed for decades. Holiday celebrations, family recipes, and community events connected the present to earlier generations. Looking back now, these details reveal how people adapted to change without abandoning their identities. Another reason the decade remains so memorable is that it existed before many of the major social and technological revolutions that would soon reshape everyday life. The internet did not exist. Personal computers were still far in the future. Mobile phones, social media, and digital entertainment belonged only to the realm of imagination. Because of this, people interacted with the world in ways that feel increasingly rare today. Conversations happened in person. Friendships often developed through local communities. News arrived at a slower pace. Life was not necessarily easier, but it was undeniably different. As historians continue studying the era, they often discover that the true story of the 1950s is not found in advertisements or popular stereotypes. It is found in the experiences of ordinary people who woke up each day, went to work, cared for their families, and dreamed about tomorrow. Their lives remind us that history is not only made by famous leaders or major events. It is also shaped by millions of everyday moments that quietly become part of the past. Perhaps the greatest reason the 1950s continue to capture our imagination is because they represent a moment when the future still felt mysterious. Today, we often take technological progress for granted. We expect new devices, faster communication, and constant innovation. But during the 1950s, each new invention seemed extraordinary. A colour television, a modern kitchen appliance, or a faster automobile could become the centre of conversation for weeks. People genuinely felt they were witnessing the arrival of a new age. This excitement influenced the design of everything from homes to restaurants. Bright colours, futuristic shapes, and modern materials reflected a belief that tomorrow would be even more impressive than today. At the same time, daily life remained rooted in routines that had changed little for decades. Families still gathered around dinner tables. Neighbours still visited one another without making appointments. Children still spent much of their free time outdoors. The contrast between rapid progress and traditional living created a fascinating balance that defined the decade. Many people who grew up during those years later described them as a time of possibility. Opportunities seemed to be expanding. New careers were emerging. Education was becoming more accessible. Businesses were growing. For countless families, the future appeared full of promise. Of course, not every dream became reality, and not every problem was solved. Yet the optimism itself became one of the decade's most enduring characteristics. Looking through old newspapers and magazines reveals just how strongly people believed in progress. Articles predicted future cities, advanced transportation systems, and technologies that sounded almost magical. Some predictions proved surprisingly accurate, while others now seem charmingly unrealistic. Yet they all shared one common idea, the belief that the future would be better. History teaches us that every generation imagines tomorrow differently. The people of the 1950s imagined a future that reflected their hopes, fears, and values. While many of their predictions missed the mark, their confidence in human ingenuity helped drive innovation and change. In more ways, the modern world was built by people who dared to imagine possibilities that did not yet exist. And that is why the decade remains so fascinating. It was a period filled with ambition, curiosity, and consummament when millions of ordinary people looked toward the horizon and believed they were standing at the beginning of something extraordinary. And so, as the sun slowly sets on our journey through the strange and fascinating world of 1950s America, we are left with a deeper understanding of a decade that was far more complex than it first appears. It was a world filled with optimism and uncertainty, tradition and innovation, simplicity and ambition. People believed the future would be brighter than the past, and in many ways that belief shaped everything around them. They built homes, started families, opened businesses, and invested their hopes in a tomorrow they could only imagine. Looking back now, some parts of their lives seem almost unbelievable. Doctors promoted cigarettes. Children practiced nuclear attack drills. Families relied on technologies that now appear primitive. And social customs followed rules that feel distant from the modern world. Yet, beneath all of those differences, were ordinary people who wanted the same things most people want today: security, happiness, friendship, purpose, and a better future for their children. History has a way of turning everyday life into something extraordinary. The routines that once felt ordinary become fascinating. The objects people used every day become museum pieces. The songs they listened to become classics. The neighbourhoods they called home become windows into another time. What was once simply the present eventually becomes the past. Perhaps that is the most important lesson the 1950s can teach us. Every generation believes its world is normal, permanent, and familiar. Yet time changes everything. The future arrives, customs evolve, technologies advance, and new generations create their own versions of everyday life. One day, people may look back at our own era with the same curiosity that we bring to the 1950s, wondering how we lived, what we believed, and what we imagined the future would be. For now, the lights of the diners have dimmed, the jukeboxes have gone silent, and the shiny cars of another age have disappeared down the road of history. The neighbourhoods remain only in photographs, memories, and stories passed from one generation to the next. But the spirit of that remarkable decade still lingers, reminding us of a time when millions of people looked toward the future with confidence and wonder. And with that peaceful thought, Let the sounds of the past slowly fade into the distance as another chapter of history gently comes to rest. Good night and sleep well.